The race for Georgia's 1st Congressional District comes down to 2 candidates, and they are facing off in Savannah tonight. Republican incumbent U.S. Representative Buddy Carter fighting to serve another term in the House.
I didn't come to Washington, D.C. to waste time.
Versus Democratic challenger Wade Herring, looking to flip the seat for the Democrats.
Let's do the right thing to invest in our future.
Going head-to-head, hoping to represent Georgia in the nation's capital. WTOC presents Georgia's 1st District Congressional Debate. Here's your moderator, Mike Sela.
Well, thank you for joining us here tonight. WTOC, of course, is hosting the Georgia 1st Congressional District Debate. I'm Mike Sela, and I will be your moderator for tonight's debate. And joining us inside the WTOC studio tonight are the top 2 candidates running in Georgia's 1st District. Republican incumbent Congressman Buddy Carter and Democratic challenger Wade Herring. Thank you both for joining us here tonight. We do want to go over the rules before we start tonight's debate. Candidates will have 1 minute and 30 seconds for opening and closing statements. The candidates will have 1 minute and 15 seconds to answer a question when a question is directed to them to answer. The candidates can request a rebuttal if they are named or attacked by the other candidate in their answer. If that request is granted, the candidate will have 45 seconds for a rebuttal response. Each candidate will have only 1 rebuttal per directed question. We are joined by a live panel who will be asking the questions to the candidates tonight, and that panel includes WTOC morning anchor Kyle Jordan, WTOC evening anchor Dawn Baker, and WTOC anchor and lead investigative reporter Jessica Savage. Right now, we do want to get the opening statements, and you both have 1 minute and 30 seconds for that opening statement. And based on a coin flip before the debate, Mr. Herring, we are going to begin with you.
Thank you to WTOC and the people of the 1st District. My name is Wade Herring, and I'm running for Congress to do the right thing. I've been a church and community volunteer all my life. I've dedicated myself to public service. I'm running to represent everybody in this district. Mr. Carter represents himself, big oil, and big pharma. I am a son. My mother depends upon Medicare and Social Security. Mr. Carter wants to cut these benefits. Let's do the right thing to make sure that our seniors have these benefits remain in place. My mother worries about prescription drug prices. Mr. Carter, a rich pharmacist, wants to raise drug prices. He opposed the cap on insulin. He opposed the cap on out-of-pockets for seniors. He opposed the ability of Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Let's do the right thing to make sure we can all afford affordable care. And my late father served in the military, and I will look after our men and women in uniform and our veterans. I'm a lawyer. I believe in the Constitution. Mr. Carter voted to overturn the election. He forfeited his right to remain in office. Let's do the right thing for the people of the 1st District. Elect Wade Herring. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Herring. We want to go to Congressman Carter. You have 1 minute 30.
Well, let me begin by thanking you for having us here. Thank the moderator, thank the panelists, and WTOC. This is great. And I want to thank my opponent for being here as well. You know, folks, 2 years ago, this administration inherited a country where inflation was under control. Inflation was at 1.4%. We also had crime under control. We also had a secure border. And what has happened in that 2-year period? Now, we've got inflation at 8.3%. We've got crime running rampant in our cities. We've got a border that is a disaster right now. Fentanyl pouring across that border. We're going to be here tonight for 30 minutes. And in that 30 minutes, we will lose 2 people as a result of fentanyl poisoning, as a result of this administration putting their head in the sand and not paying any attention at all to what's going on at that southern border. Not only that, but we also have lost our educational values here in this country. That's right. Parents being told that they're domestic terrorists because they show up at a school board meeting? You got to be kidding me. That's the failed policies of the Biden administration. And that's why my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for those failed policies. That's ludicrous. We have got to have a change. I commit to you that I'm going to continue to stand up against the failed Biden policies.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Carter. We want to go to our panel right now to get the first question started for the debate. Let's go to Kyle Jordan.
All right, thank you, Mike. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here tonight. Congressman Carter, Mr. Herring, and I know I speak for the rest of the panel. We look forward to hearing your answers this evening. I know that we're going to hear a lot of differences of opinion. We've already heard a little bit of that this evening, but I want to start by hearing how you will work together, whether it's the two of you or working with other members from the opposite party. In this deeply divided political climate that we're in right now, I want to know what legislation you plan to focus on that you know can reach across the aisle and achieve bipartisan support that will benefit not only the folks here in Georgia, but our country as a whole.
All right, this will be for both candidates, and based on the coin flip and the toss and discussion before this, Mr. Herring, you get the first question.
Sure. Well, look, I've spent my career as an attorney. We are listeners, we are learners, and we are problem solvers. The way that we help our clients is to reach compromise. And I don't know how compromise got to be a bad word in Washington, but that's how we all live and how we get things done. I'm proud to say I've been married for 40 years. I know about compromise. So I will reach across the aisle to get jobs to the 1st District, to get affordable health care to the 1st District, to get investment in green energy, clean energy for the 1st District, where we know the reality of climate change. And I'll continue to work with other people to get things done for the 1st District.
Congressman Carter.
You know, the media makes out the Congress to be very divisive, and it is. I'm not going to kid you. There is a lot of division up there. But we do work together, and we work together often. You know, I have been rated as the most bipartisan member of the Georgia delegation. Republican and Democrat, the most bipartisan. The committee I serve on, the Energy and Commerce Committee, the most bipartisan committee in Congress. Look at the mental health legislation that we passed out of that committee in a bipartisan fashion. Extremely important, particularly now during this time that we are recovering from the pandemic. We need mental health legislation. That's what we passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Not only that, but also prescription drug pricing. That's another thing that we're going to be working together on. I'm already co-chairing, along with a Democratic colleague, that we're working across the aisle because we know where the problem is with prescription drug pricing. It's with the middleman. It's needing drug price transparency. That's where the problem is. And that's why I'm co-chairing that committee, along with my colleague, my Democratic colleague from Massachusetts. We're going to do something about this together. We do work together in Congress. You know, I was the lead sponsor on the John Lewis Post Office naming. I was the one who got everyone. I worked with Senator Raphael Warnock to keep open the Combat Readiness Training Center. I have worked across the aisle, and I will continue to work across the aisle when it benefits the citizens of the 1st Congressional District.
All right, we're moving on to our next question. Let's go to Jessica Savage.
Gentlemen, we remain at near a 40-year high for inflation. How will you play a role in getting us out of this?
All right, this is for both candidates. Congressman Carter.
The thing we need to do with inflation, first of all, we need to stop the spending. You know, inflation is nothing more than too many dollars chasing after too few products. The Democratic administration, the Biden administration, that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for, they have spent $10 trillion in the first 2 years. That's more money than the first 196 years that the federal government spent combined. All in that short period of time. We've got to stop the spending. We've got to unleash our energy potential here in this country, our energy resources. And we've got to cut back on some of the rules and regulations. You know, we just finished the deepening of the Savannah Harbor. All of you are familiar with that, the Savannah Harbor expansion project, where we went from 42 to 47 feet. Do you know we finished that in March of this year? You know when the permitting process started for that? In 1996. China has built and completed 3 ports since that time. We've got to do something. We've got to stop the spending. We've got to make sure that we are looking at the regulations. And we've got to make sure that we are not doing any harm. That's the key. It is the key here.
All right, Mr. Herring.
Yes. We've got to acknowledge the reality of inflation and the pain that it imposes on our families here in the 1st District. But let's do something about it, not just talk about it and point fingers. Mr. Carter talked about the port. He voted against the infrastructure bill, which will help our port and help our airport. He talked about China. He voted against the CHIPS bill, which will bring jobs back to the United States from China and help fix the supply chain. Let's make sure the oil companies aren't price gouging, but Mr. Carter won't do that because he takes PAC money from big oil. And when Mr. Carter talks about spending, he talks about spending for ordinary working folks, like cutting Social Security and Medicare, not spending for wealthy people like himself.
All right, Mr. Carter.
I do want to rebuttal. You know, Wade, there you go again. I mean, this is ridiculous. I voted against the infrastructure bill, yes, because only 9% of it went toward infrastructure. And where did the rest of it go? To these Green New Deal policies. And that's the problem with inflation. That's why we're suffering from from the highest inflation we've had in 40 years. The reason why is because you're spending too much money in Washington, D.C. The reason why is because this president, on day one, declared war on American energy. That has got to stop. We've got to cut down on the regulations. All of those things have got to do. And to say that I have voted against infrastructure, I would submit to you that no one has supported infrastructure as much as I have when I was in the state legislature, while I've been in Congress, and look at the city of Pooler. I mean, you tell me that I haven't supported infrastructure? There you go again, man. I tell you, it's just unbelievable.
Well, it's unbelievable to me that you would use Pooler as an example of infrastructure. There's one rubber stamp on this stage, and it's you voting with the Republican Party 98% of the time. I'm going to be an independent thinker and a problem solver.
All right, we want to move on to our next question. Let's go to Dawn Baker.
Gentlemen, the rent prices have been at an all-time high as well. Often we hear about people signing leases, and within a few months into it, their rent has gone up $500 to $600 more, and they're stuck. Is it time for the federal government to step in to help?
That's for both candidates. Mr. Herring?
The federal government can help with the affordable housing crisis by tax credits, which this administration has already increased the amount of tax credits, and also by investing in the Housing Trust Fund. Additionally, the representative in this district needs to represent everybody in this district and understand the realities of problems like rising rents for everyday Georgians in our district, and then be an advocate, working with local municipalities, working with the counties to bring those existing resources back to our district. And that's what I will do. I'm going to get on the phone and talk to our mayors, talk to our councilmen, talk to our county commissioners. How can I help you in our district?
Congressman Carter.
I'm not sure you want the federal government entering into the housing market. We've already experienced that once, and it didn't work out so well back in 08 and 09. But let me tell you, this is another symptom of inflation. It's another symptom of the policies of this administration. Yes, and you look at the latest figures that were just released, the CPI is up, but also the core values that they talk about, which includes housing. That's what you're looking at. That's the key there, and that is up. It is hotter than expected, and that's something we've got to be concerned about. Listen, everything's up. Gas, groceries. I had a single mom call the office a couple of weeks ago. You know, and, hey, I can't afford the gas to get to work, but I can't afford not to go to work. What am I going to do? And it's because of the policies of this administration, the failed policies of this administration, that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for. We have experienced one-party Democratic rule, and it has not worked. That's why we've got to stop this. That's why we've got to have Republican leadership in the Congress, and that's why we've got to offset and neutralize this president and his failed policies.
45 seconds. You were named.
Thank you. I do not want to be a rubber stamp for anybody, and for those of you playing debate bingo, you can mark that card twice now. I want to be an independent thinker and a problem solver for the people of our district. That's what I'm going to Congress to do.
All right, let's move on to our next question. Let's go to Jessica Savage.
Gentlemen, this question's for both of you. There's a push in D.C. right now to codify abortion rights. There's a push for a national ban on abortion. Do you think this should be a state issue or a federal issue?
Congressman Carter, let's start with you.
Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that it is a state issue. That's what Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Care was all about. It sends it out of the federal realm back into the state realm. That was the whole impetus behind it. Everybody wants to say, oh, we've outlawed abortion. No, it just simply sends it back to the states, and the states have to decide. Look, I am pro-life. Let's go ahead and get that out here right now. I believe in the sanctity of life. I believe that life is precious and should be protected, that we are all created in the image of God. And I am going to always stand up for life. That needs to be understood right now. But let me tell you, this idea, I mean, let's talk about it now. Here we are suffering from inflation. Here we are suffering from rampant crime. Here we are with the southern border that's a disaster. Here we are with our school system failing us right now. And what does this president say yesterday? That he's going to want to codify abortion. I mean, where are your priorities at? And what does he do today? Today he says, oh, I'm going to release another 15 million barrels of oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's supposed to be for emergencies, but he's using it as a political tool. And my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C., so he can be a rubber stamp for those failed policies.
Mr. Herring. Yeah, rubber stamp 3 times. Let's be very, very clear. Mr. Carter has been out front proposing a national ban on abortion to criminalize abortion without exception, not even rape, incest, or life of the mother. He's been very upfront about that. It's wrong, it's dangerous, it's cruel. The right to an abortion is based upon the constitutional right of privacy, a fundamental right of any woman to make her own health care choices with her doctor. A politician does not belong in that room with the woman and the doctor. Yesterday, Mr. Carter said he thought Georgia's 6-week heartbeat bill would be a good model for the rest of the nation. That's his position, not that it goes back to the states. He wants to criminalize abortion at a national level.
Congressman
There
Carter.
we go again. I mean, it's unbelievable here. First of all, you want to talk about the extremist here in the abortion debate, then you talk about my opponent, and you talk about the Democrats who want to be able to perform an abortion up to the time of birth and to have the taxpayers pay for it. That's ridiculous. And to refer to abortion as health care, abortion is not health care. And health care saves lives. Abortion ends lives. What do you not get here? This is not a conglomeration of cells. It's not a mass of tissue. This is a baby. And you keep talking about a room where you got the patient and you got the doctor. There's also a baby in that room. Somebody's got to speak up for that baby. Again, these are the types of policies that you see from the Democrats in Washington, D.C., that my opponent wants to go to Washington and be a rubber stamp for. That's 4, I believe.
If I can respond,
yes,
please.
You get the last word on this.
Yes. So nobody says that abortion should occur right up to the moment of birth. Nobody says the federal government should pay for it. The Hyde Amendment prevents that. That statement isn't factual. It isn't based on the law. It isn't based on medical science. It's just flatly wrong, and it's meant to gin up fear and anger and division.
All right, we're moving on to the next question. Let's go to Dawn Baker with that.
Well, crime has been rising around the nation, and right here in Savannah, we've already passed 100 shootings this year alone. What do you believe can be done from the federal level to support communities around our country, from the largest cities to the most rural towns, in order to bring crime down?
This is for both candidates. Let's go with Mr. Herring.
Sure. First, let's make sure that we've got proper funding for our police departments, including our smaller police departments and law enforcement departments in our district. Let's make sure that they've got the right amount of money to attract and retain police officers. Let's make sure that those resources are in place. But let's also make sure that our children have educations where they can dream about the opportunities that are available for them in our country. Let's make sure that we invest in mental resources so that people need that, can get the help that they need, and not be locked up in jail where they can't. Let's make sure that we do all of those things together. Let's work on gun safety, the bipartisan bill that provided for background checks and red flag laws. Mr. Carter voted against. So let's do all of those things. It's a big, complicated problem, but let's quit pointing fingers. Let's listen, learn, get the facts, and let's make a decision and act.
Congressman Carter.
Well, finally, my opponent got something right. You're right. The educational system is lacking, and we need to address that in this country. So thank you for finally getting something right. But let me tell you, what's the problem with crime right now? The problem with crime is that it is the Democrats' rhetoric about defund the police. Defund the police. Soft on crime. We've got attorney generals, we've got district attorneys who aren't enforcing the law, who aren't prosecuting people. And that's where the problem is right now. Look, our law enforcement officers are heroes, and we should treat them as our heroes, and we should treat criminals as criminals, because that's what they are. We are never going to solve this crime problem by simply throwing money at it. Yeah, it's important. They deserve to be paid, and paid well. But let me tell you, until the Democratic Party decides that they're going to support our police and back the blue, like I have done and like I will continue to do, that's not going to happen. This crime problem is another example of the failed policies of the Biden administration that has led to rampant crime again, that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp.
Let me be very, very clear. I support the police, and I want to make sure they have the resources that they need. And Mr. Carter and I actually agree upon that. Mr. Carter's had 8 years in Congress to do something about it. And this is where we are with him as our representative. That's why we need to make a change.
Wait, do I get to rebut that?
Yeah, you do get last word on this.
Last word on this is, I've been in Congress 8 years. The Biden administration has been in control for the last 2 years. That's when crime has spiked. That's when inflation has spiked. That's when we've had a disaster at the southern border that's allowing fentanyl to cross our border, that's killing 200 people every day in this country. 200 people. In the 30 minutes we're going to be here tonight, 2 people will die as a result of fentanyl poisoning because this administration is ignoring the southern border. Those are the failed policies of the Biden administration. Those are the policies that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for.
All right. Thank you, both candidates. We do want to take a quick break, but stay with WTOC. We will be back with more of Georgia's 1st District congressional debate after this. Welcome back, everybody, to Georgia's 1st District U.S. Congressional debate that we have going on here. I'm your moderator, Mike Silo. Welcome back. We are joined with our 2 candidates, of course, Republican incumbent Congressman Buddy Carter and his Democratic challenger, Wade Herring. This next portion of the debate, we will have questions that are directed to specifically one candidate. However, we do want to reiterate, if that other candidate is attacked or named in the answer, they do have the right to a rebuttal. So let's begin with this section of our debate. Let's go to Jessica Savage with the first question.
Representative Carter, this question's for you.
Sure.
Let's talk about January 6th.
Okay.
You voted against the creation of a committee to investigate the January 6th attacks. Well, that bipartisan committee has presented hours of testimony and evidence. Has any of that information changed your position? How so?
No, it has not, and I would not refer to that as a bipartisan committee by any stretch of the imagination. When the Speaker herself took off the Republican nominees, the appointees, I should say, that the minority leader had proposed. You know, this is a made-for-TV theatrical event that we're experiencing here. Look, I had condemned what happened on January 6th, and I continue to do. I did it at day 1, minute 1. What happened then was wrong. Those people should be arrested, given due process, and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But you know, when I'm in the district, I'm not hearing about January 6th. I'm hearing about inflation, I'm hearing about crime, I'm hearing about the southern border, I'm hearing about education of our schools, but I'm not hearing about January 6th. Look, January 6th has been handled here in the voting irregularities in the state of Georgia. We now have the Voter Integrity Act, which the Election Integrity Act, I applaud the state legislature for what they did. They made voting easier and cheating harder. You only have to look to the primary and see where we had record turnouts. That's what we needed. Now people have confidence that our votes are counted.
All right, our next question goes to Kyle Jordan.
All right, Mr. Herring, this question is for you, and in light of what we're talking about with January 6th, the specter of what that day was all about, ultimately overturning the election results, the questioning of our election and integrity. We've made strides over the past 2 years, but here we are 2 years later. We're 3 weeks away from an election day. Do you have confidence in the election system, not just in the state of Georgia, but federally, that we are prepared for something like this? And do you have confidence that in those election results, win or lose?
I have confidence in the current election system. I think we need to continue to advocate for voting rights, and I have confidence in the results. But let's address the threat that January 6th posed. On that day, after a violent insurrection in the Capitol, Mr. Carter stood on the floor of the House to stand to overturn the election, standing next to Marjorie Taylor Greene. And as I sat at home anxiously wondering what would happen to the future of our country, I could not believe that Mr. Carter would do something like that. He took an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution, and that night, without any basis in fact or law, he violated his oath of office, and he has said subsequently, after time for reflection, that he would do it 100 times over again. That kind of behavior poses a threat to our nation. It's why I'm running, and I'm deeply concerned why Mr. Carter should come home.
Mr. Herring, that's your time. All right, our next.
Do I get a rebuttal?
You do, 45 seconds if you'd like.
Again, my opponent seems to be obsessed with January the 6th. When I'm in the district, what am I hearing about? I'm hearing about the failed policies of this administration. Inflation. I'm hearing about crime. Yes, people in Savannah are concerned, and they should be. There's crime in our streets again. I'm hearing about the southern border. I'm hearing about fentanyl. I misspoke the other night at a town hall meeting. I had a lady who told me, she said, "Sir, you call it fentanyl addiction. It's not. It's fentanyl poisoning." She was right and I was wrong. She said, "My son took one pill and he died." God bless that woman. I did misspeak. This administration that he wants to go to Washington, D.C. so he can reinforce and be a rubber stamp, they are completely ignoring that.
That is your time. Yes, you 45 seconds because you were named, and then that's the last word.
Mr. Carter violated his oath of office to defend and support the Constitution. That is fundamental to our democracy. And if he's not hearing it, it's because he's in a bubble and not listening to the people of our district.
All right, let's move on to our next question. Let's go to Jessica Savage.
Representative Carter, this
Yes.
question's for you. A new report by the Department of Health and Human Services shows that prescription drug costs are rising faster than inflation, rising on average 31% between July of 2021 and July of this year. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed recently requires pharmaceutical companies that raise the price more than the general rate of inflation to then pay Medicare a rebate. It's supposed to offset drug prices for Americans. In a party line vote, you voted against that. Why'd you do that?
I voted against that because, as you know, the Congressional Budget Office, we refer to it as the CBO, has said that this policy will result in 15 fewer cures coming to market in the next 30 years. Now, I asked my opponent, what are those cures going to, is it the cures for Alzheimer's? Is it cures for ALS, for diabetes? Which 15 is it? This is not the way to do this. And trust me, I'm a pharmacist. I know. I was the one on the other side of the counter who watched the senior citizens as they tried to make a decision between buying medicine and buying groceries. I was the one who watched the mother in tears because she couldn't afford the antibiotic for her child. Yes, I told you earlier, I am now co-chairing a committee that is going to address prescription drug pricing. No one in the United States House or the United States Senate has worked harder in the last 8 years to bring prescription drug prices down than I have. I was the one who got the gag clause law signed into law during the Trump administration, to where a pharmacist can tell you, hey, if you pay for this and not use your insurance, it'll be cheaper than your copay. Yeah, that was my legislation. Unlike my opponent, who's going to go up there and be a rubber stamp
That is
for
your
these
time,
failed
Mr. Carter?
policies.
That is your time? 45 seconds rebuttal?
Yes. Mr. Carter, as you said, voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, voted against the requirement that drug companies rebate to Medicare, voted against the ability of Medicare to negotiate drug prices, voted against the cap on insulin prices, voted against out-of-pocket caps for seniors. That's his vote. He's a pharmacist who made millions and millions of dollars selling drugs to seniors. He gets a lot of money from Big Pharma, including after he voted against the Inflation Reduction Act. What he's done is wrong, and he said on Fox Business that he wants to raise the price of drugs. He's really interested in that
You know,
because he's
that's
a
That is your
pharmacist.
time, Mr. Herring? That is your time.
Do I get to rebut?
You get 45 seconds.
You know, the excerpt that you talk about on Fox Business, and you say I wanted to raise prescription drug prices, again, my opponent just does not get it. He doesn't understand it. We can bring drug prices down in this country. Did you know that there was a study done earlier this year by the Berkeley Research Group that showed that only 37% of the price of a drug goes to the pharmaceutical manufacturer? Which begs the question, where does the other 63% go? It goes to the middleman, goes to the insurance company. It doesn't go to the patient. That's why I have legislation that said that rebates will go to the point of sale and go to the patient. That's why I have legislation that says that there will not be any rebates anymore, that we'll cut that out so that we can lower drug prices, unlike what
That
he
is your
wants to
time,
do
Congressman
and
Carter.
kill cures.
Let's move on to our next question. Let's go to Dawn Baker.
Mr. Herring, you do not have a voting record. Mr. Carter does. Do you feel that that will give you an advantage in this race?
Yes and no. I do not have the power of incumbency.
I've never seen that on the voting card, yes or no. Sorry.
I don't have the power of incumbency like Mr. Carter does. I don't have the franking privilege like Mr. Carter does. But what I do have is a record of community service to all the people of this district. I have a record of integrity. I have a record of telling people hard truths. And I have a record of problem solving. I think the voters of this district know that, and I will take those same principles that have guided me my whole career to Washington.
All right. You would have 45 seconds if you want.
You know, I've never seen on the voting card that we use in Congress, yes and no. I mean, it's either yes or no. So I don't know where he's coming off on this, but, you know, there are tough decisions to be made in Washington, D.C., and some of these votes are difficult. Listen, I'm all for infrastructure, and I didn't understand that about infrastructure in Pooler earlier. I couldn't be prouder of the city of Pooler and what we've done in the way of infrastructure there and the way we've grown that city. But you know, again, the policies, it's the policies that count here. And that's what's crushing America now. This war on American energy, this inflation that it has created. And that's what my opponent wants to go and be a rubber stamp for in Washington, D.C.
That is your time. You got 45 seconds. Last word on this.
Sure. Look, I recognize the complicated nature of problems that face our nation and face the Congress. But this business about making it simplistic, that it's either or, right or wrong, up or down, that's part of the reason we're in the fix we're in right now. You've got to look at all sides, all facets, get all the facts, make a decision, and act.
All right, let's move on to our next question. Let's go to Kyle Jordan for that.
All right, Congressman Carter, this is for you. We're talking about voting records, so we'll stick with that.
All right.
You voted to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
In fact, dozens of times voting to do that. The Republican-controlled House narrowly passed the American Health Care Act in 2017 when the Republicans also had control of the Senate and the White House.
Right.
It never made it through the Senate. Here we are 5 years later. We don't hear people campaigning on this anymore. Is this not an issue? Is it not a priority? Or will we see another push to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act in the future?
What we will see is another push to address health care, and we've got to address health care in this country, including prescription drug prices. That's why I'm working on that. That's why I serve on the health care subcommittee in Energy and Commerce. All of this is extremely important. There are things that we can do to address health care costs, and we need to be doing them. Yes, you're right. I did vote for the American Health Care Act. I was in that 27-hour, 27-minute committee meeting with Energy and Commerce when we passed it out of the House. And yes, you are correct, because one senator said this instead of this, it did not pass. I thought it was good legislation, and we could have done better. But you know, that's the problem in Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan said years ago, if you'll give me 80% of what I want, I'll consider that a victory. But in Washington, too often, we let perfect get in the way of very good. And we've got to get over that. We've got to just, and then for my opponent to say, well, votes are complicated, you don't get to say it's complicated, and I like this and I like that, but I don't like this. It's either yes or no. And with the Democrats in control, that's what they do. They pack bills full of stuff that you know you can't vote for. And my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for that kind of policy.
That is your time. Mr. Herring, 45 seconds.
Yes. Mr. Carter repeatedly tried to kill the Affordable Care Act. That would have done away with insurance for pre-existing conditions. It would have done away with insurance for children older than 21 who haven't yet found their way. Mr. Carter would have killed the Affordable Care Act, and when the pandemic hit and thousands of people lost their job, they would have had no option because insurance would be tied to employment. He famously said, even if everybody in the district wanted the Affordable Care Act, he would vote against it, and that's why he doesn't have town halls anymore.
That is your time. We want to move on to our next question. Let's go to Dawn Baker, who is our next question on our panel.
Mr. Herring, how will you be a congressman who truly represents coastal Georgians and not just be considered a guaranteed vote for Democrats in Washington?
Look, I don't want to be a career politician. I've had a career. We've already got a career politician in Washington. We don't need another one. I don't want to toe a party line. We've already got somebody who follows the playbook and doesn't think for himself. We've got that already, and it isn't working. I'm going to be a congressman who listens and learns and shows up and then makes decisions and acts. I'm going to be a congressman who reaches out to local elected officials and says, how can I help? That's the kind of congressman I'm going to be, who represents everyone in the district. And we don't have that right now, and that's why we need a change in Washington.
You know, it's pretty obvious he's never served before with that kind of attitude. I mean, unbelievable. Yeah, I've served. I've had the honor and privilege of serving as a mayor of Pooler. I had the honor and privilege of serving in the Georgia State Legislature, and I've had the honor and privilege of serving in the United States Congress. Public service is important to me. You know, my grandfather was a sharecropper. My daddy worked at Union Bag. He worked shift work. He worked hard. I was the first one in my family to graduate from college. I built a business. I was successful. I have lived the American dream. And that's why I go to Washington, D.C., so that my children, my grandchildren, and everybody in the 1st Congressional District will have that same opportunity to live the American dream. I graduated from Groves High School. I am a product of this area.
That is your time, Congressman.
If I could
Yes,
respond,
45 seconds,
please.
last word on this.
If you want to talk about a record, in the General Assembly, Mr. Carter voted against Medicaid expansion. When he was mayor of Pooler, the Department of Justice sued the city for a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Yes, public service is important, and I respect anyone who goes into public service. But Mr. Carter got to Washington and lost his way, and he doesn't represent us anymore. He represents Big Pharma and Big Oil, and you can look at his FEC filings and you can see it.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to take a break at this point. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with some more questions. I want to make sure that we get enough time so you have your closing statements as well. So stay with us here on WTOC as we bring you Georgia's 1st District Congressional Debate after this break. Welcome back, everybody, as we get ready for the last part of our Georgia 1st District Congressional Debate. Good to have you with us. I'm Mike Seela. We want to get right to the questions with our two candidates. Let's go to Dawn Baker.
All right, just about everyone, no matter what walk of life, has in common is we are all disgusted with telemarketers. We get the phone calls, we get text messages, they bombard us. As a congressman, there must be something that you all can do to help us. You will be our hero if you can. What would you do?
All right, Congressman Carter, we'll start with you.
Well, there has been legislation passed and laws passed that would prohibit this. It continues to be ignored. Look, this is a big problem, and I get people asking me about it and complaining to me about it all the time. It's something that we need to clamp down on. We need to enforce the laws that are on the books now. If you're on the no-call list, but you're still getting called, I just recently went through my emails and started unsubscribing from things. And that's one of the things that we are addressing specifically in the Energy and Commerce Committee is the telecommunications, the platforms and how much power they have. Because look, they have too much power. And we've got to address that. They are influencing our children in a negative way. I believe in the freedom of speech, and I don't want to have to do this. I've told them, we've had the CEO of Facebook, of Twitter, and of Google, and I've told them, I don't want to have to do this, but if you don't clean it up, we're going to have to clean it up. And they still don't do it, so we're going to have to do something, and we are going to do it. Unlike the Democrats who continue to ignore it.
Mr. Herring?
Well, let me say I understand the problem of robocalls and telemarketers, and I agree we need to do something about it. And I'm also concerned about the power of social media platforms, and I agree we need to do something about it and address it.
Okay, we want to go to Jessica Savage now for our next question. Jessica?
Well, major economic developments in our area, like the new Hyundai plant that's coming to Bryan County, already facing some major challenges from some federal legislation. What will you do to make sure that multi-billion-dollar investments like that one continue to happen in Georgia?
Mr. Herring, we're going to start with you.
Okay. The issue is about the tax credit for electric vehicles. And Hyundai Kia is almost up against the limit of 200,000 vehicles. The issue is we want to encourage American manufacturing, so the tax credit isn't available for foreign-made vehicles. Hyundai is going ahead with the groundbreaking. I got an invitation the end of this month, so I think their reservations must have been addressed. But if there needs to be further federal action to make sure that we secure that plant here, when I am in Congress, I will work for a short gap method before they open 18 months, 2 years from now, to make sure that they come here and provide those jobs.
Congressman
Again,
Carter.
this is an example of when you have a one-party Democratic rule. You know what happened with the Inflation Reduction Act? It didn't go through regular order. That is, it didn't go through the committee process. If it had gone through the committee process, we could have vetted it. You know, one of my favorite sayings is none of us is as smart as all of us. If we had vetted this through the committee process, but no, the Democrats, they wanted to just go ahead and ram it through the whole Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, is increasing inflation. It's the worst thing we could do. And it has put in jeopardy this project, the biggest economic development project in the history of the state of Georgia. And what makes it even worse, and hear me on this now, what makes this even worse is that the Democratic president, Joe Biden, was in South Korea just a couple of weeks before and assured the leaders of that company that they were going to be taken care of. And then he passes this legislation, and now they're all upset, and it's jeopardizing this project. Senator Raphael Warnock could fix that. He could have fixed it, but he didn't. And that's the Democrats' failed policies that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for.
45 seconds, Mr. Herring.
Yeah, Mr. Carter voted against the Inflation Reduction Act. So instead of being part of the solution, he wants to now point fingers. I just said I want to fix that if that's an issue. I'm not a rubber stamp for anybody. I'm a listener and a learner and a problem solver, and the people of this district know that.
All right, let's move on to our next question. Let's go to Kyle Jordan.
All right, gentlemen, this question is for both of you. I know you knew each other personally before the campaign began. How has that affected the way that you have approached this campaign, the way you've approached your opponent, and ultimately, how will you continue to work with your opponent beyond this election?
Congressman Carter, let's start with you.
Look, I've been doing this a long time, and I don't take any of this personally. We disagree. You know, Joyce Griggs ran against me, and Joyce and I, we don't agree on policies, but I respected her, she respected me. I didn't lie about her, I didn't lie, and she didn't lie about me. My opponent has lied about both of us. And that's a shame. And yeah, he's tried to bring up our church in this. Our church doesn't have anything to do with this. And yes, I've known him a long time. I disagree with him. I disagree with him on abortion. I disagree with him on economic issues. I disagree with him on a lot of things. Is he a good person? Am I a bad person? Am I a bad person? Is he a good? No. We just disagree on policy. And that's the problem in Washington, D.C. right now. I know you find it hard to believe, but I've got a lot of good friends who are Democrats. And we get past this, and we have to, and we'll get past this. We'll be sociable to each other again. I'm not going to let this ruin a friendship. You know, I've got too few years left to do that. So it's just a shame that, you know, he wants to bring up the personal thing that he talks about, finger pointing. What has he done all night long but finger point at me? I mean, give me a break. This is crazy.
Mr. Herring?
Yes, I've been telling the truth. You can fact check me. I've been talking about his record and who he takes money from and who he works for. And yes, we did know each other, and I respected his call to public service. But the night that he stood on the floor of the House and voted to overturn the election and violated his sacred promise, his sacred oath to protect and defend our Constitution, and jeopardized our country in that way, following a violent insurrection in the Capitol, I had to do something. For evil to prevail, good people have to stay silent. I wasn't going to stay silent. What happened on January 6th was wrong. His vote to overturn the election was wrong, and I stood up to address that wrong.
All right, we do want to get to our closing statements right now. We are running out of time here, so we already did the coin flip. And Mr. Herring, you will have the first closing argument, and you will have the last word, Congressman Carter.
Okay. There is a basic contrast between the two of us, and the election boils down to right versus wrong. Let's do the right thing to protect women's lives. Mr. Carter wants to criminalize abortion without exception, including rape, incest, and life of the mother. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous and it's cruel. Let's make sure that women have the freedom to make their own health care choices. Let's do the right thing for affordable health care. Mr. Carter, a rich pharmacist, takes a lot of money from Big Pharma. He voted against the ability of Medicare to negotiate drug prices. He voted against the cap on insulin prices. He voted against the out-of-pocket cap for seniors. Let's do the right thing for a healthy Georgia. Let's do the right thing to bring jobs to Georgia. Mr. Carter voted against the infrastructure bill, which will help our ports and the airport. Mr. Carter voted against the CHIPS bill, which will bring manufacturing back to this country from China. Mr. Carter voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, which will help prevent further climate change and create many, many jobs. I'm asking you to vote for Wade Herring and do the right thing for the 1st District of Georgia. Thank you.
You know, if this wasn't so ludicrous, it'd be hilarious. Ladies and gentlemen, this election is not about me. It's not about my opponent. It's about you. It's about you being crushed by the failed policies of this administration. Elections have consequences, and the reason elections have consequences is because policies have consequences, and we are suffering through the consequences of the failed policies of the Biden administration that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for. Inflation was at 1.4% when he took office. He immediately declared war on American energy. Now inflation's at 8.3%, 8.2%. Now the price of gas, the price of groceries, the price of housing. Now crime is running rampant in our cities. Now our southern border is a disaster with fentanyl flowing across that border, poisoning our children. 200 people every day. 200 people. That's like putting a plane load of college students on board a plane and having the plane crash every day. We've been here for 30 minutes. We've had 2 people die because of fentanyl poisoning. This administration ignores it. This administration calls people who show up, parents who show up at an education, a school board meeting, domestic terrorists. That's the kind of failed policies that my opponent wants to go to Washington, D.C. and be a rubber stamp for.
That is your time, and that we want to thank both of our candidates for joining us here tonight. We have Republican incumbent Congressman Buddy Carter and his Democratic challenger Wade Herring. We want to thank them both for taking in this spirited debate tonight. We also want to thank our panel for asking those questions as well. And remember, early voting is already underway. In fact, Georgia's already seen a record turnout, so do go out to vote. To find out more, you can go to WTOC.com for the latest. I'm Mike Sela. Have a good night, everybody.